There's a story about the Second World War that most of us were taught. A story of extraordinary sacrifice and moral clarity. Of democracies rising to defend freedom against the machinery of fascism. Of Churchill defiant at the microphone. Roosevelt marshalling the industrial might of America. Of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the service of a cause that history would vindicate. It is a story of the good war. Of necessary suffering in the service of a necessary victory. This script is about a chapter of that same war that has been meticulously erased from the version taught in British schools and from most popular accounts of Churchill's leadership. It is about 3 million people who died not in battle, not in the camps of an enemy power, but in a province of the British Empire. While the Empire was winning the war, they were nominally dying to support. 3 million people who did not starve because there was no food. 3 million people who were, in the most precise economic language available, priced out of existence. Bengal, 1943, not a battlefield. A breadbasket. One of the most fertile agricultural regions in Asia, producing rice in quantities sufficient to feed its population many times over. The food existed. The tragedy was not a failure of harvest. It was a failure of entitlement. The destruction of the economic mechanism that allowed ordinary people to convert their labor and their wages into food. When that mechanism was systematically dismantled by imperial policy, 3 million human beings discovered that the circulatory system that connected them to survival had been severed. Not by an enemy, by the government that claimed to be fighting in their name. To understand what happened in Bengal in 1943, you need to understand the economic architecture that the British imperial system had constructed across India in the preceding decades. India was the jewel of the British Empire, but it was a jewel that was expected to pay for its own setting and to contribute substantially to the cost of the imperial structure around it. The mechanism for extracting this contribution was the sterling balances system, an arrangement by which India's exports generated credits denominated in British pounds sterling held in London, which could be drawn on to fund the British war effort. When Japan entered the war in December 1941 and rapidly overran British possessions across South and Southeast Asia, the strategic and economic pressure on India intensified enormously. India became the primary base for Allied operations in the region. It was required to supply not only its own administration and defense, but the massive logistical infrastructure of a major theater of war. The British government made a straightforward calculation. The costs of this war effort would be met, as far as possible, by India. The sterling balances accumulated. The Indian economy was placed in the service of British strategic objectives, and the printing presses of the Reserve Bank of India began to run. Between 1939 and 1943, the money supply in India roughly tripled. The rupees being printed to fund war expenditure were not backed by a corresponding increase in the goods available to purchase. Military procurement swept through the Bengali economy, removing vast quantities of rice and other goods from the civilian market, at prices set by the military authorities. The prices paid were not market prices. They were procurement prices, determined by the buyer's power rather than the seller's need. And the rupees that flooded into circulation as a result of this spending drove up the price of everything else, most critically food, in a province that was already operating under significant strain. This is where the forensic accounting of the Bengal Famine diverges most sharply from the conventional narrative of natural disaster. A cyclone in October 1942 damaged some of the autumn rice harvest. A fungal disease reduced the winter rice crop. These were real agricultural shocks. But Bengal had experienced harvest failures before without 3 million people dying. What made 1943 different was not the scale of the agricultural failure. It was the destruction of the economic mechanism that allowed people to respond to that failure. The inflation produced by war financing had outrun wages in ways that made food unaffordable to the people who needed it most. The denial policies compounded the catastrophe. With Japanese forces in Burma and threatening the eastern frontier of India, British military planners adopted a scorched earth approach to the assets of coastal Bengal. Boats were confiscated or destroyed, specifically to deny them to a potential Japanese invasion force, stripping fishing communities of both their livelihoods and their primary protein source. Rice stocks in certain areas were removed or destroyed as a denial measure to prevent their falling into enemy hands. Bullock carts, which provided the transportation infrastructure of the rural economy, were requisitioned. The circulatory system of the Bengali rural economy, already under pressure from inflation, was being physically dismantled by the administrative machinery of military necessity. The result was a trap with vicious jaws. Rural Bengalis who had survived previous hardships by diversifying their income, by fishing, by moving goods between markets, by accessing the credit networks of local merchants, found every mechanism of survival being closed simultaneously. Fishing was impossible without boats. Transport was impossible without carts. Credit was impossible as collateral values collapsed. The food existed somewhere in the system. Bengal was a net exporter of rice in 1943, a fact that was noted with bitter precision by those who were watching people die. But the price of accessing it had risen beyond the reach of the rural poor. If nobody has explained to you that the Bengal Famine of 1943 was not primarily a natural disaster, but an economic catastrophe built by imperial policy, that 3 million people were priced out of existence by inflation and denial, while food was being exported from the province. Subscribe now. The forensic accounting of this event is one of the most important and least told stories in the history of empire. Stay with us. Calcutta in 1943 presents the historian with images of such devastating contrast that they read, from a sufficient distance, as almost too neat to be real. The city was functioning as a major logistics hub for Allied operations. Hotels and restaurants were serving multi-course meals to officers, administrators, and the officials of the imperial government. The cabarets were running, the clubs were open. The machinery of colonial social life continued to operate with a normality that required a particular kind of selective vision to maintain, because on the streets, outside those establishments, and on the steps of government buildings and in the parks and along the roadsides of the city, people were dying. They arrived from the countryside in waves, drawn by the rumor that Calcutta had food relief, walking journeys of many miles in conditions of advancing weakness. They arrived skeletal, carrying children who had already died, carrying the sick who could not walk. They collapsed in public spaces, they foraged through refuse. They begged from passers-by who had learned, through the psychological necessity of proximity to mass suffering, to look past them. The scale of what was happening was visible to anyone who chose to see it. The officials of the imperial administration in Calcutta were not sequestered in some distant office. They were moving through the same streets. The dying were on their doorsteps. The refusal to respond at the scale the crisis demanded was not a failure of information. It was a failure of priority. The Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, and then his successor, Lord Wavell, sent repeated communications to London documenting the scale of the crisis and requesting emergency food imports. The responses from London were not silence. They were active refusals. The argument made in London, and specifically in the War Cabinet under Churchill's leadership, was strategic necessity. Shipping space was finite. The war effort required it. The demands from India had to be weighed against other priorities. The logic was not without internal coherence. Shipping was genuinely scarce. Other theaters of war did genuinely make competing claims on it. But the logic was applied through a hierarchy of value that assigned different weights to different lives. When grain shipments were diverted from India to maintain British civilian stockpiles in 1943, the calculation being made was that British civilians deserved a buffer against shortage that Indian civilians did not. When Churchill responded to one of Wavell's increasingly urgent telegrams about the Bengal situation with the question of why, if India was so short of food, Mahatma Gandhi was still alive, the answer he received from his officials was carefully diplomatic. What the question revealed was the cold architecture of the calculation. The lives at risk in Bengal were not valued in the same currency as the lives of the British citizens whose political support Churchill depended on. The moral calculus of empire is not expressed in declarations of contempt. It is expressed in allocations of resources, in the decisions about which shortages are emergencies and which are acceptable management problems, in the weight given to different categories of human suffering when those categories compete for the same finite resources. Bengal in 1943 was not a priority, not because the suffering was invisible. It was documented in extraordinary and harrowing detail by Indian civil servants, British officials in the field, and journalists who published what they saw. It was not a priority because the people dying were not people whose deaths created political costs for those making the decisions. Relief eventually came, but it came slowly and it came late. Wavell, who replaced Linlithgow as viceroy in October 1943, pushed more aggressively for military grain distribution and eventually secured a commitment to emergency imports. By the time the relief operation was fully operational, the acute phase of the famine had run its course. The demographic accounting of what had been lost was conducted in the months and years that followed. The estimates of the death toll converge around 3 million, though some scholars place the figure higher. The excess mortality attributable to the famine, the gap between the deaths that occurred and the deaths that would have occurred in a normal year, represents one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century, occurring in a territory under the direct administrative control of a government that had the resources and the capacity to prevent it and chose not to deploy them at the scale required. The famine etched itself into the DNA of Bengal in ways that outlasted the event by generations. The experience of watching parents sell everything they owned, of watching siblings die in sequence as food ran out, of walking to Calcutta on the hope of aid that arrived too late or not at all, these experiences were not processed and left behind. They became part of the foundation on which political identities were built. The Bengal Famine was a formative event in the development of Indian nationalism, not because political leaders cynically exploited it, though some did, but because the experience of it demonstrated more clearly than any argument could the nature of the relationship between the empire and its subjects. It showed who the empire was for and who it was against when the choices were genuinely difficult. The partition of India in 1947, the independence that followed, the bitter communal violence that accompanied it, all of these have their own complex causes that extend far beyond 1943. But the famine is part of the chain. It is one of the events that made the continued claim of British imperial governance to be a benevolent administration of a developing subcontinent impossible to sustain with intellectual honesty. The moral authority that the British Empire claimed, the idea that it existed to bring order and development and civilization to territories that could not yet govern themselves, was not simply weakened by Bengal 1943. For those who had experienced it or watched those they loved die in it, that authority was annihilated. The official Indian government's Famine Inquiry Commission, reporting in 1945, attributed the disaster primarily to the failure of the market mechanism produced by wartime inflation, compounded by administrative failures and the denial policies. It did not attribute it to an intentional policy of starvation. The distinction matters for legal purposes and for the politics of blame. It matters less for the purpose of understanding what happened. Whether the mechanism was intentional or the product of policies pursued for other reasons, whose famine-producing consequences were foreseeable and foreseen, the result was the same. 3 million people died. The food was in the system. The mechanism that should have distributed it to the people who needed it was broken by policies made in London and Calcutta and Delhi by men who understood what they were doing and chose to continue. The forensic accounting of the Bengal famine does not produce a story of simple evil. It produces something more uncomfortable, a story of a system operating according to its own logic, valuing certain outcomes above others, assigning certain lives a weight in its calculations that made their deaths an acceptable cost of pursuing larger objectives. That system did not describe itself as indifferent to the lives of Bengali peasants. It described itself as fighting for freedom and democracy against the darkest forces the modern world had produced. Both of those descriptions were, in their own terms, accurate. The gap between them is the moral legacy of the Bengal famine. It is the distance between what the empire said it was and what it did when the choices became genuinely difficult. History is not over, it is underwritten.